Recording started, and Dr. Anderson, the floor is yours.
Kanipi, welcome to today's Decolonization in Higher Education Forum. We appreciate your taking the time to join us this afternoon. And we begin by acknowledging the land and all our relatives, human and more than human. Bridgewater is located on Wampanoag lands, and we thank them for their stewardship over the millennia. We must think deeply about the founding of a country that is built on stolen lands by stolen bodies. As an institution, we must be responsible to recognize the colonial histories that impact our relationships with Indigenous peoples in the land, as well as those within the BIPOC communities. At Bridgewater, we've held several internal forums to address racial justice and racial and social injustices, and we have established the Presidential's Racial Justice Task Force. However, there is a concern about the ways that decolonial pedagogies and decolonizations are being applied or not. This forum will take a deeper look at the colonial legacies and how intertwined the university is with these colonial ideologies. We will not move forward in our efforts for racial justice unless we are willing to untangle ourselves from these embedded practices. Today's event is sponsored by Native American Indigenous Studies Program, the Martin Richard Institute for Social Justice, and the Minnick Institute for Global Engagement's Global Programs. And so I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then they will give a larger introduction. Each of them will speak for about 10 minutes before they engage in a conversation with each other, which will be about 20 to 30 minutes. And then following, we'll open for questions and conversations. As you're listening, if you want to put questions in the chat, because sometimes you get to the end and you forget. and as Jabbar said, we will monitor those as we go along. So our first speaker will be Linda Jeffers Coombs from the Aquinnah Wampanoag, and then Leigh Patel from the Education for Liberation, and then finally Natana Hicks Greendeer from the Mashpee Wampanoag. So I'm going to mute myself and let them take over. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Linda Jeffers Coombs from the Aquinnah Wampanoag tribe. I'm a longtime resident of Mashpee, and I think about it, tomorrow will make my 44th anniversary of living with this other Wampanoag folks over here, who I've come to love and respect very much. I'm going to be talking a bit about the history. My background is in museums. I've worked at the Boston Children's Museum, 30 years at Plymouth Plantation, number of years at the Aquinnah Cultural Center on Martha's Vineyard, and have been working independently in the last 2 or 3 years. And so over all of that, I've grown into being a historian and an analyst of history as well. So I wanted to start off by talking about Columbus for a few minutes. I've been thinking about him lately, having had a discussion with someone, because when he first landed in the Bahamas in 1492, the people there, the indigenous people there, came out as a group to meet and greet him and his crew. They brought food, they were singing, they were welcoming, they were open. And instead of viewing that as a good thing, as the way that people should be, as a way that Christians strive to be in their own values, he took it as them being guileless or like innocent or foolish, I don't know. And he chose to interpret that these characteristics would make these people good slaves. And that thinking came from the fact that they were not Christians. And in my thinking, they clearly didn't need to be because they were kind of already there. They were primitive, and so therefore they were inferior. And this is a thinking that carried all of the different explorers, and then the English and the English settlers, the Pilgrims, when they came here in the 17th century. When they came here, they came into a landscape that was, beautiful and forested and lush and abundant. There were trees that were 100 feet high, 6 feet in diameter. A single flock of birds could number in the millions. The fish were so plentiful when they were coming up the rivers on their spawning runs. It said that you could walk across the river on their backs. The deer were so plentiful that even though it was one of our primary sources of food and skins for clothing and so on, their populations were not diminished at all. We were, at least prior to the plague of 1616, thriving, a lively, numerous, busy people, busy villages, and nations of people. We had everything we needed. We had a comfortable life. We had knowledge that was passed down over thousands of generations. We knew how to live on this land and with this land without destroying it. We had long established systems of values, the primary one being respect. Respect for life. That's something you hear a lot. And I wonder if people think deeply about it, or just, oh yeah, respect for life, or, but what does it mean? To me, it means that all the other beings, the non-human beings, all of them, from ants to grass to grains of sand to the clouds to the winds, everything is alive, and as such has a right to its own life. Other beings have a right to their own life. And if you think of that with some of the things that go on today, it kind of hits me right between the eyes. I mean, I drive down the street and all of a sudden there's trees in somebody's yard they just decided to take down, or a whole section of forest is cut down because they're going to put in more houses or a business or, something like this. So that's how I look at it very specifically. We had, and we still have, specific methods and traditions that when we had to take a life to support our own lives, we did so with prayer and thanksgiving and gratitude, with a recognition or an acknowledgement that we were taking a life, and no life is insignificant. And our prayers and our thanksgiving, our gratitude are integral parts of all of the processes that went into taking that life. It was not just lip service. It wasn't folklore. It wasn't quaint anecdotes. I was reading this over before the program here today, reading it aloud to myself, and instead of saying anecdotes, I said antidotes, and I was like, well, there's a Freudian slip for you. However, the Europeans believed, or they wanted to believe, that we did not know how to work with the land. They complained about we just let it sit there, but they didn't understand how we lived with it. Okay. And we did the things that we did, all of our prayers and thanksgiving, because rather than just being lip service, that is what kept the respect top of mind, kept it present in our minds on a daily basis. So when the Europeans came here, they wanted the land, they wanted the resources, which is gold, timber, furs, sassafras, whatever, depends on where they landed. They had to establish the processes to acquire these things. And in order to acquire the land and the resources, the people of the land have to be dealt with in a way that enables these European goals. These are the processes of colonization. And a lot of times, just recently, within the last year, I asked someone to define colonization. And the response I got was, well, that's when a group of people leave their country of origin and they move to another country and they settle there. And I said, is that it? And they're like, I get the, I guess so. I don't know, whatever look, and what's missing from that is the intent that the people come over with, their actions when they get here, and the impact that had on the people and on the land. Okay. So one of the first things to hit Wampanoag country, for example, was disease. I mentioned the plague of 1616, which lasted for about 2 years. It's known as the Great Dying, and it came from southern Maine, swept down the coast, and went right through the middle of Wampanoag country and wiped out 75 to 95% of our entire population, which is something that I believe we haven't recovered from yet today. We've never been able to gain back the population numbers that we had prior to that time. John Smith referred to this as, God clearing the land for a better people. Still have a little trouble with that attitude by him, I might add. Religion. I look at colonization as like a many-headed hydra, or like a, I don't know, multiple-legged, very bad octopus. There's all these tentacles. It's not just one single action at one single time. This is a series of processes that many of which have become systemic, and they still go on, and we have to learn to recognize that. Religion was one. Christianity was something that was forced on us, and it basically, I don't have too much time here, but basically it was convert or die. So, not much in the way of options there. Slavery was something that began here with Native people, not just Black people. And I think, there were a lot of slavery over the decades of the 17th century. And at the end of King Philip's War, Native people, not just Wampanoags, but Narragansetts, Pequots, Mohegans, whoever, were just shipped out of here wholesale just to get rid of us and sent down to the West Indies. Indenture, that came in even before the war, but after the war, it was just another form of slavery. And while English people were putting their own children in indenture, they would go in at age 8 and learn how to be a blacksmith. And then at age 18, they had a trade and they could be released from indenture. That was not the case with Native people. It just sort of went on and on endlessly in many cases. People were manipulated into debt. We never had money. So when that whole system came in, it was a new thing. And it had a purpose. The manipulation had a purpose, which was, oh, you don't have the money to pay off your debt? Well, you got, 20 acres over there. I'll take 3 or 4 of them and you'll be square until the next time you need a quart of milk. And then we'll talk about the next 3 or 4 acres. Or they could pay it off with their oldest child, because removing children from the home was a widespread practice, not isolated incidences, but a widespread practice, because it was believed that the English could bring our children up better than we could. And I believe was the predecessor of what became the boarding school system that has been and still is, so very damaging to Native people. There's a whole body of colonial laws that was developed by 1660, including a whole section on how to deal with Indigenous people. And those laws prevented us from practicing many of our traditional ways. Our powwows, our medicine people, our healers were considered witches and wizards and sorcerers and, and all this sort of thing. And some of them, of course, involve land. One of my favorite ones is that any person who wanted to buy land from an Indian had to have a license or a permit. And if they didn't get that document, then the land was forfeited to the country. I thought about that. I'm like, well, that's interesting. It doesn't just get returned to the Indian person that owned this land in the first place. It went to Plymouth or Boston or whichever government was functioning at the time. There was anti-Indian legislation that was enforced where, with the stroke of a pen, the government of Rhode Island or Massachusetts or whomever would say, well, these people aren't a tribe anymore because they're mixed blood and they're this and they're that, and they don't practice their traditional ways, go figure. And so they're not really Indians, but if you say they're not and you put it into law, then you can act like they don't have the same relationship with the land. Okay, so it's just another mechanism to get land. Sterilization was something that was ongoing. It might still be ongoing. I don't know. It was ongoing into the 20th century. I was just reading a book by Mary Bravebird, who is Lakota, and her sister was sterilized, unbeknownst to her, against her will, in the 1970s. And this is simply a method of stemming any population growth. Psychological warfare. There's lots of examples of this because, over time, people were made to feel bad about being Wampanoag or whatever their tribal nation was, as if they were less than human, because that is the thinking that produced all of this anyway. And for example, in 1698 on Martha's Vineyard, there was a teenager, 16 years old, by the name of Caleb Ohama. And he was a Christian. He had converted to Christianity, but it was almost like he was obsessed. Everywhere he went, this man, this boy had a Bible under his arm. I don't think he could go to the bathroom without having this Bible. He just didn't know how to act. And if he was in school or wherever, other people just got tired of listening to him preaching. So they would go out in the woods, tell it to the trees, anybody, we've heard it. And he would just go out there and, I forget the term, but when you beat yourself and, so to me, this is like, he was obsessed with being a good Christian. How did a 16-year-old get to that point where he felt that he had to act like this? He couldn't put that Bible down to do anything. And to me, there was so much going on, like guilt tripping people into being Christians, or what is a good Christian, and what examples of what was bad Christianity was all the Wampanoag parts of their life. And those are just a few examples that, just a few, raked off the top. So with all of this, and through my thinking about all of this, I've come to believe that we all are responsible for history. Okay? We all are responsible, each and every one of us. And this is not about laying blame for things that happened in the past or were perpetrated in the past, but it's about taking responsibility for, number one, learning about the actual real history as much as is possible. It's always biased by whatever author there might be, but we can get to a point where we can learn, some of the things that actually happened and how they affected people. We can learn what the myths, the stereotypes, the misinformation, the historical erasure, we can learn what those things are so that we know not to believe in them anymore, so they don't keep getting repeated. We can be responsible for achieving the understanding that as long as a list of colonial practices continues, there will be no equality or equity. Okay, this includes the thought processes that create, employ, or perpetuate any of these colonial practices. Okay. And we can be responsible for learning what it means, what is entailed, in how our thoughts, our behaviors, and our actions might change if we truly have respect for all living beings. I won't just say people, because it has to include all the beings on Earth. We can't just take humans out and put them in a bubble and go, oh, we all respect each other, and then the Earth is falling apart, and what happens to us? So I'll leave it at that, and thank you for listening to me today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, for giving us such a solid basis and understanding the history with these lands. And the history is always in relationship to these lands. So my name is Lee Patel. I get a paycheck from the University of Pittsburgh, and I am a proud National Board member of Education for Liberation. What I'd like to do in a few minutes is really connect to many things that Linda was teaching us and hone in on higher education. And what does it mean to use the word decolonize with higher education? So as Linda pointed out, like so much of colonization has to do with, in my understandings and my readings, with two primary things. One is ranking. Who counts as a worthwhile being? And that's so often just human beings. And who is lower than that? So the project of settler colonialism that's ongoing in the United States and in Canada and in Israel and in Australia, in many places, that project seeks to do three things at the same time. And those three things actually need each other. The first is to claim the land, but not to claim it as grandmother, as elder, as grandchild, as relative, as intricately tied to just life. It is to claim it as property. And so one of the first moves that settler colonialism, any kind of colonization makes, but particularly settler colonialism, because it's interested in occupying the land, it wants to occupy the land in the interest of property. It wants to have it be an inert entity. That's it. It has no life. It just is a thing. So I'm going to stick my stake in the land and it becomes property. It no longer is a living thing. And I think more profoundly, it is no longer a relative. And that means that my responsibilities to it become very, very narrow. If I understand land to be property, my interests are to either own it and maintain and grow my ownership, or try to own it, rather than stewarding it, rather than actually learning from it. That the land will actually tell me things about when it's appropriate to draw from it, as Linda was speaking, when it's appropriate for me to ask for its offerings. It will tell me that if I listen well enough and if I'm taught to listen. That's if I understand land as a life form unto itself. Like land and as a life form doesn't need human beings. But when human beings regard land as proper, they need land as relative. All living entities are intertwined that way. They need each other as relative. But when we regard land as property, we only need it in order to say we own it, which kind of is trying to make something like water. You know, water is very viscous. And you can throw it into a freezer and that kind of makes it into a solid form, but it will start to melt and change. Even in the freezer, it will start to change forms. So we're trying to do things with land that fundamentally what so many Native people have taught us, tried to teach us, that for me, as I understand myself as an arrivant to these lands, to Turtle Island, we're trying to do something that really isn't going to work. And we're going to do quite a lot of damage in that process. So thinking about land as property, and I'm still just talking about one part of settler colonialism, just this first part, like putting the stake in the land, like this is my land. So you can think of all like manifest destiny, this rush to the West, and that included many different kinds of people to be erasable. So if a person is or a throne is going to claim a land, there's this problem that people are already there. So it gets harder to claim that land as yours if people are already there. And as Linda spoke about, so one of the ways is just to remove those people, engage in genocide. And we do this also through the things that we teach in schools. So many of the students who come to Bridgewater, so many of the staff, the faculty who come to Bridgewater, to any institution, may have well come through a U.S. schooling system that teaches them that there are these unfortunate things that happen, like the Trail of Tears, but Native people aren't alive anymore. It doesn't teach about the nowness, and that as soon as colonization started to happen, so did decolonization. So a person, La Paperson, has written a book called A Third University is Possible. And one of his major points is that let us not over-determine colonization everywhere. That there are always ways that people have refused, people have found side passages, people have created literally spaces underground to hide and hide away. So it's very important for us to remember this is not a complete project that is without hold, is permeable. People do things with it to get away from it. But in trying to erase indigeneity, which is an incomplete project, we know just by the people that we're with on this particular Zoom configuration, it has attempted, but it has failed to erase indigeneity. It has failed to erase Native peoples, but it's ongoing. When I am in Pittsburgh, I'm teaching in Pennsylvania, and that's where the Carlisle boarding school is found. And this is one of the first boarding schools in which the project, as many of you are familiar with this, I'm seeing a few nods, the motto of the, thanks for that choice, A Third University is Possible, that citation is in the chat. The motto of the Indian Bureau of Education for so long was to kill the savage to save the man. And if you think about this, if you name people as savages, then you also get to claim that land as savage. And so then you as a settler have this doctrine of discovery that really obligates you to tame these people or get rid of them, and to tame the land, to also really manipulate the land in ways so that it is the kind of property looking thing you want it to be. This is why we have, I don't know how many golf courses in the desert in a place called Las Vegas. Like, this makes no sense, but we do it because we want the land to do certain things. So in higher education, we've got these things going on. When I am in Pittsburgh, the School of Education is located on a street called Bouquet Street. And at first I thought, well, that's really lovely. Bouquet, flowers, sounds nice. Bouquet Street is named after Colonel Henry Bouquet, who was tasked with the distribution of smallpox-infected blankets to Native peoples as they were being pushed through from where they had relation to land, pushed through these lands that we now call Pennsylvania to various different reservations. And along that, so it's not only the removal, but the removal contained tactics of genocide within it. And that's who that street is named for. So one of the things that universities, I believe, are obligated to do is understand their role in these machinations of colonization. What roles have we played in simply relative to the land upon which the university, colleges, its buildings, upon which they reside? And what was the history of those lands before? So often in curriculum, when we teach about, when we teach about Columbus, how often do we learn about Anacaona, the Haitian princess who became the Haitian ruler and chose death at the age of 29 rather than surrendering to be a concubine to Columbus or one of Columbus's people that Columbus was traveling with? So it's important that we also understand the resistance and the ways of being that people have created for themselves alongside this massive attempt of genocide. So I talked about there's this land, you got to claim it as yours and kind of freeze it into being this static thing called property. To do that, we need to try to erase indigeneity as much as possible. And the third thing is because so much of this is about property. So in settler colonialism, you don't want to just put your flag in the ground and claim that land is yours. You don't want to do the work on the land. You want to be able to have the land to grow crops, to do different things, to be sold. As Linda was saying, for land grant institutions, those institutions were named as land grant institutions by stealing indigenous land, by stealing native land and redistributing it through the federal government. One of my favorite notes about this, and it might be because I'm pretty obsessed with The Office, but Cornell University is known as a land grant institution. When it was established, though, the federal government had ran out of the lands it had stolen from Native people. So it said instead, well, we have a lot of timber from Wisconsin, and we can give you that. And Cornell was able to sell that timber that got itself into a place where it now has an endowment and is a well-funded university. And that's kind of what I mean by a reckoning and tracing, like what has been the relationship to land as property? And what has been the relationship to the people who have stewarded that land and are likely still around? What has been the relationship to that? So the third thing that I was getting at in settler colonialism is that when an entity, a person, could be a group of people, owns quite a bit of land, they don't want to work the land. They want to own it and to be able to build more wealth from it. So this helps to explain how the relationship between enslaved people and we work on stolen land. So the shortest phrase that I often use to talk about the United States and other places that are settler colonies is that this is built through stolen labor on stolen land. So understanding the relationship of stolen labor is really key to also understanding the transatlantic slave. And for us to understand what it means, as Christina Sharp puts it so beautifully and does so throughout her beautiful book, what it means to live in the wake of slavery. This does not mean that slavery has ended, but we are living in a different kind of moment of it than other moments of it. So when I think about this, when in relationship to a university context, the word reckoning comes up for me a lot. There's lots of reckoning to be done, which means learning lots of histories that we've been prevented from learning, but that we are always able to learn. And it doesn't need to be a formal class. In fact, I think there's a great deal to be said for forming study groups that don't have grades attached to them. Thanks, Diana. Kay Wang Yang also is the person who publishes under La Paperson, so that's a great resource. I think there's a great deal to be said for finding a group of people like, yeah, I'd really like to learn more about this. I'd love to read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book about an Indigenous people's history of the United States, and just have a study group and come together and talk about it. I think even that is actually decolonizing the ways that we assess people after they've read a book. I'm a voracious reader. I would stop reading books if I had to write a book report every time I got done, or take a quiz or a test. I'm like, that doesn't sound like fun. I'll watch something on Netflix instead. So I think there are ways that we can start to actually take the hierarchy out of what we do in higher education. That's one of the things that I think is really important. So we can think about the relationship to land. We can think about how we are with each other. So higher education is such a hierarchy. I know you all know this. Like I so often I've thought, well, I think the Catholic Church kind of rivals us in terms of being a hierarchy. Perhaps also the military kind of rivals us, but it's a strict hierarchy. And I think we should agitate those hierarchies because how we are with each other is so much more substantive than what a title is. And then sometimes titles absolutely need to be respected. But when we're doing it in order to maintain the hierarchy that has particular cultural ways of being that consistently reward the same distinct population again and again and again, that's a hierarchy gone wrong. And in my opinion, that's the hierarchy of higher education. It has been kind of wrong since jump. So if you read Craig Stephen Wilder's book, Ebony and Ivy, yep, I see lots of nods. You learn about the ways in which stolen labor built so many of the nation's beloved Ivy League institutions. And then if you think about the two moral acts, that those are the federal decrees, which said, all right, well, let's use, didn't say this, but let's use stolen native land and make it property, and we'll create land grant institutions out of that. And it was in the 1850s. And those could only be attended by white land-owning men. The second moral act is often attributed to creating HBCUs. But if you look at the, I'll put a particular piece up in the chat a little later by a scholar named Catherine Weedle. And what she did was actually look at the debate surrounding the second moral act. And it's very, very clear that none of the Congress people, all male, all white, all settlers, they did not have an interest in historically Black colleges having any kind of substantive resource. They thought it would be good to be there, but separate and not funded as well. So that history is entirely in the present. I wanted to say one thing as well, and I'll close on this because I really can't wait to hear from the other people who will speak, and then be in conversation with each other, which is almost always more interesting. So we've reached a point where we are getting in the habit of doing, some people call them land acknowledgement statements, sometimes they're referred to as repatriation statements, sometimes rematriation, if we have an understanding of the matriarchal systems that were and are in place. And I've written some of these, I've read several, and I think that, you know, the genre itself is gesturing toward, it is acknowledging. And in the same way that Tuck Yang wrote that decolonization is not just a metaphor, and there's a lot of really wonderful work that they do in that piece, but overall what they're saying is, you can't just say like decolonize this room, decolonize that room over there, decolonize this subject, decolonize that. It actually has to mean a rearrangement of thought, of relationality, and that must include something about the land as life. There's no two ways around it. It must include something about that. So the statements that we are reading these days, I think are a genre that should be followed up with more. What we've been talking about when people ask me at the University of Pittsburgh, well, at first they ask me if I have a statement that can be read, which I think, well, gee, these are things that really should be written in relation with people. They should not be written by one person who's not a Native person sitting by themselves in a room. Like, that's not a terribly relation-driven activity. So I usually say no, which is annoying. And then I say, it's a genre, it's there, like, and we can build relation with people, with the Native people who are alive in this area that we now call Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania. We can do that, but what do we do after? Would we, for example, fly the flags of the nations and tribes who were and are in this area? That usually puts a pretty full stop to the person who's asking me about this. But to me, that's what it would mean. That's still a symbolic reckoning. And then more in a fine point, like, what is it about our curriculum that has to be rewritten? And ironically, the first settlers that Linda was referring to, they figured out really quickly how to rewrite their journals. Like, their initial interactions include exactly what Linda was saying. It's like these people, very friendly, offered us many things. They would make fine slaves. That's in one of Columbus's first journal entries. But then they start using the word savage more so, and they start talking about their role in relation to that. So I think decolonizing also applies so much to curriculum. It applies so much to who is even working and earning a living from the campus, from the university. So I know that Bridgewater State has had, a series of collectives and gatherings. And so for me, a constant question is, how are Native peoples being supported through these efforts? And so that's not especially to Bridgewater. That's just always a question that I'm asking. And so our curriculum has to change a lot. How we teach needs to change quite a lot. And if we think about also knowledge as a life form, this is the last point, I promise, for me. Like knowledge not as an inert object, but as a life form unto itself. And I've been thinking a lot, and I was sharing with the group when we met a little bit earlier, that I've been thinking a lot how much stories pass through us. And part of what we do in relation to our elders and people younger than us is we carry stories, and we learn stories, and we tell these stories. And a university might call these theories. But they are stories and they are theories. They are both. And I think about how much we need stories. We absolutely need stories to make sense of our relation, to learn what our relation and what our responsibility is. I'm not sure that stories inherently need human beings. I know that they communicate through many other life forms and human beings. So I guess my point there is maybe if we could decenter human beings' needs, we might see a little bit more of how much life forms interact with each other. And I think that makes it a little bit easier for us to do things like not think so hierarchically and not think so much about having property, or at least enables us to have a richer conversation about property and from whom property has been withheld, and what things we might do, like have universal health care instead of owning a home being the way that you are most secure in society. So yeah, just thinking that we need these stories, but knowing that they don't necessarily need us might help us to see the relation and the life among many entities that don't include humans all the time. Thank you very much. And I cannot wait to hear from my friend, Natana Green Deer.
Tapton Tamawash, Lee, Kawonk Linda, Winiki Sak, Wamiki Mal, Kataptanamu, Wikon Thamanat, Ninuet Yukiskak. Hello, everyone. My name is Natana Greendeer, and thank you all for inviting me to come and speak today with all of you. I currently am working for the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project as a director of language development. So I'm working with teachers to help to increase their fluency for their various different classrooms that they're teaching. So we have community classes for Wampanoag language, and also an immersion school that goes up through 3rd grade. And also we teach language in some public schools. And so I help to train those teachers. And also currently I am a adjunct professor at Brown University and in the American Studies department. So today I wanted to start first by talking a little bit about what is decolonization. Actually I'm gonna show a slide if I can have that function. I think can I have that? Whoops, I think I do.
You can.
Yes,
Yeah.
I can now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so so this past fall, I was working with our teachers and some of our parents of our students to talk about our curriculum at our immersion school and how, as a school, we are working towards a decolonized education for our students. And so we talked about what that means. And in Wampanoag language reclamation efforts, we often have to create new words because we don't have a lot of written record for more modern concepts, and certainly not something like this. And so we decided to create these terms, and as you can see, they're not short words. But so the word for colonization is chachika no masawayu wonka na hyonk. And the word for decolonization is nompi sompo montamu wonka nyonk. And in these little charts, you can see sort of the breakdown of what these words mean. And in our conversation about colonization, we decided to use these pieces of words in Wampanoag. The words are long because they have a lot of meaning within them. And so the word for colonization really actually, so it goes in order here down the list, but really it actually starts with this idea of cheek, not cha. But the second one here, cheek, means violently and forcefully. And the cha is just sort of emphasizing that next syllable, that next morpheme, is happening consistently over time. It's not just an isolated incident. It's not something that happens, in a vacuum. It's something that is consistent and sort of dependable. And so from there, the violence that's happening is to put someone inside of a box. And so anom, inside, asawayu wonkan, a box or a square. And then the ahi part means that you're doing this to someone, that the object of this action is someone animate, someone that had like a free will. And then, of course, the last part of it just makes this a noun. But so when we were thinking through what we wanted this word to mean, we landed on asawayu wonkan, this word for box, or this morpheme for box, for a couple of reasons. And so one is that, sort of the obvious literal meaning, right, to sort of be walled in and have, limited options and have taking away one's ability to expand and to grow, right? But also the other side of that is that in our Wampanoag culture, we think of things as round, right? As cyclical. And so boxes and squares are really outside of what it is for us to be Wampanoag people. And so it has this double meaning for this word. So this is how we conceptualized colonization as a group of Wampanoag teachers and parents and community members. And then in thinking about that, we thought about what does it mean to decolonize, right? To get out of this box. And what we didn't do was sort of just make it the opposite, right? We didn't say, get out of the box. And instead we decided to think about what is it that we're actually trying to do by sending our children to this school, by being a part of a program like the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project. What is the goal in that? As Wampanoag people, as a community. And so the word that we built, nompi sompo montamu wonka nyonk, for decolonization, as a whole means to live righteously again on purpose. And so you can see the little pieces of this, right? Nompi means again, sompo is righteously, although the P is missing in the bigger word. But this is life. And then onk again is noun. But I think the most important part of this particular word, this created word, is the EE part. And that means to do it on purpose with your body. So there's body and mind in play here. So it's not just a sort of like a hope that we can move forward. There's actual real intention in this effort, and not just in the mind, but also in action and what we do. And so take that down. So it's not just about how we think we should move and what the vision is, but really how are we acting and what are we doing to move out of colonization, to move past colonization. And So in contextualizing this for higher education, this makes me think about, Audre Lorde's quote, the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house, right? So if we are in this institution of higher education, how is it that we can use this towards decolonization? Or can we? Is it really possible to do that the way that it's currently set up? Or does it have to be really dramatically changed in order to really work towards that end? And so I think for me, when I think about how this can happen, one of the biggest things that I think about is how we prioritize and respect knowledge, and whose knowledge is prioritized and respected. And to Lee's point about a hierarchy, there's so many limitations about who can put forth their knowledge in a university setting, right? If you have a PhD, then you are qualified to do that. Or if you have this degree, you're qualified to do that, or this set of, qualifications, whatever they may be. And that really limits the knowledge that is able to be included, right? So it often limits not just the individuals who can be a part of that, but also it often eliminates and marginalizes bodies of knowledge, right? So in this case, we're talking about Indigenous knowledge that's so often missing from the conversation that happens in higher education. And I think that, if we're talking about things like land acknowledgements, for example, I think that's a good step, I think, in including a voice that's not necessarily always included in the university, because I do think that oftentimes land acknowledgements are created with some inclusion of community, although that's not always the case. But I think that to take that a step further and to actually, as Lee was saying, think about what does that mean in this case, right? So if we, for this particular forum, it began with a land acknowledgement, but what did that mean today, right? For all of us who are not all in the same place, and for all of us who are, coming to this from different places, versus what does that mean when you're, on campus, versus what does that mean if I give the land acknowledgement, versus if Lee gives it, versus if Linda gives it, versus, whoever it may be. And so thinking about all of those pieces that come together in allowing the knowledge to be part of the university, I think is just really important. And changing the rules is really what needs to take place in order for that to happen, right? Histories, like Linda was talking about, those are stories that are not necessarily part of most college students' education, right? All of that is I can't even think about how many students I've taught where we've talked about Native history or Native contemporary, anything, it could be on any range of topics, whether it's education, it could be language, it could be health. And there are always students who had no idea about many of the topics that we're talking about. And so without the ability to bring that information in, and to really have the effort made on the part of the university, of the academic departments, of whatever leadership is able to make these decisions, to allow that to be grown in the university. And I think not also just what information is being given, but how that information is being given as well, is really important. And so there's not always a common ability to take information in this sort of like standardized way that we give it in a university context as well. And so many Native students that I've worked with have had a really hard time being in university settings. There's so much attrition from Native students, right? Having to go home after a couple of years or a couple months sometimes of being away from their homes and their communities. And I think that's something that also needs to really be considered, is how are we teaching? How are we reaching our students? And I think if this is the case for Native students, then this is the case for many students, right? So how are we able to reach all of our stakeholders, right? So it's not even just about teachers, or I'm sorry, it's not even just about students. It's also our teachers. It's also our, community members who are involved with the university in different ways. So I think I will end there for now, just in the interest of time. So I think we're sort of running behind. So,
So I think Lee and Linda and Natana, if you wanted to just maybe talk for a few minutes together, and then we'll open up for questions. So if anyone has questions, if you want to put them in the chat or just be thinking about what you want to say.
I'll say that just as in a response to Lee, your comment about land as a relative and as a relationship, just relating that to Wampanoag language. When we talk about land in Wampanoag, we talk about it as being part of us, literally part of us. It's not separate. You cannot say my land without saying it like it's like, it is me. I am it. We are the same. So.
Yeah, thank you for that, Natana. One of the people I'm working with is a Native Hawaiian woman from the island of Kauai. And in her work, she's translating a great deal to the university, and she says exactly that. Like, I am not from Kauai. I am Kauai. So, yeah, I appreciate you saying that. That's important to remember. And I feel like I didn't say it. I think I should have said this like with more force or more oomph. That so many times, too many times, Native students in education are, and well-established scholars. It doesn't have to be a student. Are told that their stories are nice, but not theory and not research. And so, to me, that's another articulation of this attempted genocide.
And I think that happens also. It's not necessarily always just coming from the outside either. I think that there's a lot of that same sentiment even within Native communities, that, in order to gain X respect, or, to have a certain amount of power behind your voice, that it has to be published, or it has to be, it has to be accepted in a very specific category of knowledge, as opposed to, otherwise it's just seen as anecdotal or, personalized. And I think that's, I think that happens a lot even within our own communities.
Mm.
I was just thinking about, you know, between what you just said, Natana, about how, you know, we in the land are one, and what you said, Lee, about the land doesn't need us. And the first thing I thought of was the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which I'm sure many people are at least familiar with if you haven't read it. And her her story, I mean, this is something that actually happened, but she had a student, and they you know, had to go through all sorts of hurdles to get this produced as a you know, an actual study, to study actually sweetgrass. There was sort of an ongoing contradiction within the community, people who harvested sweetgrass for basket making and whatnot, because some people wanted to cut it off at the root, and another school of thought, rip it up by the root. And so everyone was arguing about which way was better, which one was more damaging, and all of this sort of thing. They finally, you know, after however many hurdles in the school, in the university, did get to do the study. And it turns out that both ways were equally effective, equally good, and equally did not harm the sweetgrass or the land the sweetgrass was growing from. And what was the key element was humans just interacting with it, with the sweetgrass, because there were other patches of sweetgrass that no one went and harvested with, no one thinned it, no one worked with it. You know, they weren't acting with this other being, interacting, and the sweetgrass wasn't growing as well. So. It's my phone, sorry.
I was thinking about two phrases that I hear a lot in education, particularly as education has to make its own money. So I'm also so appreciative, like money hasn't always been a thing, and debt hasn't always been a thing, but debt is a big thing now. I always think about this phrase that we hear a lot of, best practice. And to me, that's just a silly phrase, because it basically says, well, if you here's the thing you can do. It worked here, do it over there. And so it strips all the context out. And then I think of so many of the grant applications that people do in universities, in communities, and for many different reasons, we need to ask for money, right? And oftentimes it asks for like a scale up ability. There's probably a better word for that, but I think you all know what I mean. Like it's asking for it, how will it be replicated, or how will it be grown? And Linda, what you were just saying about braiding sweetgrass reminds me, like, maybe it should not grow, and maybe it should not be taken out of context, or maybe it should not be bothered.
I don't know, I kind of saw that the point was that the sweetgrass should be bothered, because in being used by humans, it was better for it. And the humans also made beautiful things with it. And also it's used ceremonially and other things, you know. So, you know, it's an interactive process between humans and other forms of life. You know, I've even read about where some tribes, I can't remember what tribe, but they somehow like even altered the course of a river, and that somehow it benefited the people. For I don't know if they were agricultural or what the deal was there. This a long time ago I read this, but it also benefited the river and all the environment around the river, the animals and the whatever. And it was just like, to think that people, you know, had that knowledge and understanding and ability to do that in a way that was good and created something good and wasn't destructive. It was just, amazing to me, So, and I think that comes from, thinking, just growing up in a situation where we and the earth are one and the same, which we don't have today in the mainstream society at all, so it's just so important that we do what we can to get back to that while we have an earth left to get back to,
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's a great example just now that happened in real time, like me over determining kind of a colonizing lens. Yeah, so thank you so much for that correction.
And it's absolutely the same thing, just different people, different situation, but colonization is colonization, no matter what hat it's wearing, right, or what cloak it's wearing.
Oh, thank you. I think we'll maybe go toward questions, but one of the things that I wanted to, just something that you said, Lee, about best practices. So a colleague from Papua New Guinea of the Modewa clan, Raglan Mad Dogs, said to me once, he uses the term wise practices. So to bring in all the knowledges that we have. So, but I think, Diana, you look like you were ready to ask a question. So I'm going to ask if you'd like to either elaborate on what you had in the chat or.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to share, since the students from my He, She, Two Spirits class are here, and I put some of the ideas that were discussed today in the chat that we've also considered in the class, just to share that this effort to decolonize the university is beginning. And for some of us in some of our disciplines, like mine, anthropology, it seems more clear how we can go about addressing our curriculum, our modes of learning, and other departments seem to struggle more. One of the ideas that I've suggested to some of my colleagues in the natural sciences is that all human beings have always employed forms of science. There has had to be experimentation in order to know what to eat, what to build with, what to wear, and that the scientific method is one form of science. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And then I have another question, if you don't mind, if there's time for it. I wanted to refer to the Natana's thoughts about what is valued in academia, what kind of knowledge, whose voices, what is considered theory, and these questions are emanating certainly from Indigenous voices, but also from feminism and from human rights. For instance, in human rights discourses, testimonies are absolutely necessary to highlight human rights abuses. Feminists have underscored the importance of subjectivity, personal stories. Black feminists in particular have talked about personal experience as the root of theory. And it seems to me that the powers that be that are so enormous that threaten us can only be challenged when multiple movements that see things similarly come together. But in order to do that, there also has to be a theme of decoloniality. For instance, in environmentalism, the ecological movement claims that it is the origin, that the idea of permaculture comes from Western science, but indigenous peoples around the world have practiced what we call permaculture in their own languages and methods for many millennium. So my question is, so the first question is native science and what your thoughts are on that. The second question is the opportunities for multiple movements to come together to transform the existing powers that be that want to strip the land and greed and wealth, and et cetera, et cetera. White, heteronormative, capitalist patriarchy. What your thoughts are about these collective movements and decolonizing perspectives of those. Thanks.
I think in terms of the science question, I think this is sort of like a double-edged sword, I think, because on one hand, there's the sort of exclusion of tribal knowledge in science from the academia, right? And at a detriment to the broader conversation about science, right? In whatever field it might be, whether it's environmental science or astrology or whatever, right? Or astronomy rather. So there's that, but then there's also this idea, I think, that within tribal communities, there's hesitancy to have that knowledge included in the conversation. And so whether or not to include it and how to include it, and again, who can be the one to include it, is really what I think complicates that, because to put knowledge out there is really to risk the theft, right, of that knowledge. And we know that to be true because it's happened so many times over, in all areas of Indigenous knowledge, or, whether it's tangible, tangible items, or whether it's knowledge or other abstract things. And so while I think that it's, again, important to include and to bring in, people with these different backgrounds, outside of academia, I think it's, and I'm not a scientist, so it's, for me to say it's, I guess, not as personal, although I guess from my perspective as a linguist and as a person who's working on Wampanoag language, for example, whether or not to teach that at Brown, for example. And that's a conversation I've had with a few different people, but does it belong there? Does it belong at Brown with, no Wampanoag students currently? I don't know. Maybe, but maybe not. Probably not. I don't, and it's not just for me to say, right? Also.
Right. I mean, because Western, in my Two-Spirit class, recent research in labs and neuroscience and about, hormone distribution and chromosomes, all that scientific knowledge about human biological sex now is in support of what people have known in their own cultures, that gender and biological sex is diverse. But when Western science remains I guess the validator of everything, then it sustains those hierarchies. So it is a real double-edged sword. I mean, how to be inclusive and then also not appropriate.
Diana, I'm thinking about that as I should change my background so you can actually see the room that I'm in. So I'm coming to you, and this is I want to really thank Natana for bringing this up. I'm not in Pittsburgh. I'm in my mother's house. I've been here since March 18th last year. So I'm like, campus closed. I'm on my plane to be with my mother. And we have a lot of really beautiful artwork in the house that came from India, from what we can now call India. So I can swivel. I can show you some of that artwork now. And so my mother and I have had these conversations over, this beautiful, what is a gift in amidst so much suffering. We've had these conversations as we've talked about stories. We've talked about the epic of the Ramayana, and I'm like, why isn't that the Sitayan? Because can Sita be the main protagonist in this story? And there is an animated version in which she is the protagonist. And we've talked about how we look at the artwork, and there's so many deities, and there's so much in the artwork that was created before the British came to India. And we've talked about the ways in which the British at that time in the colonial empire and occupation and extraction in that part of the world worked so hard to create animus between Hindus and Muslims. And so we just talk about these things. And in some ways, Natana, I'm thinking about how much easier that is to do in our home space. Because we're not going to write anything about it or have to think about who's going to write it and who's going to read it and what might we need to explain for them to read it and understand it. And I think those spaces, at least from that particular story and history, are really important for them to be able to be cushioned, and have a whole and a roundness to them. And I'm also thinking, Natana, a conversation that you and I had years ago about the tendency in research to pick things apart into pieces and then throw them into a program, and that program does something with them. So there's the holism and the holistic, and I think is resonating for me right now. Well, my mic is on, and then I'll mute myself again. I think about freedom dreaming a lot. And the last, I don't know, however many weeks or months you want to think about it and how it's affected you. We've seen again and again the violence of white male nationalism, white heteropatriarchal nationalism. We've seen that. If somebody did not know what intersectionality was, that person in Atlanta who killed those women definitely understood what intersectional vulnerability is. So I don't know any freedom movement that doesn't understand that there are distinct yet deeply connected ways that we've been lied to, basically. But we've come to love these lies. I'm pulling here from some of the language that Darnell Moore uses in his memoir. We've come to believe those lies even when they tell us the worst things about us, even though they're untrue. So I think that multiple movements are necessary in order to undo some of those lies, and not to collapse everybody to everything is everything and everyone is the same, but in order to understand that these distinct differences are connected under an overarching goal of domination by a few.
Thank you. I think, Simone, you had a question in the chat. Would you like to?
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Hi, Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for this. And I had a question for Nitana. First of all, it's nice to see you again. It's been a few years that we haven't seen each other. I've seen Cameron, your husband Cameron, more recently. And I have a question regarding the definitions that you brought up on that slide, and particularly the one about the decolonization, the inclusion of the element of intentionality, which first of all, from a personal comment, it's really, I think the way that you construe these two terms is probably the best evidence of how the language is really alive and dynamic. So that's testimony, if needed, that the language is really, alive, and it's great. And I really like as I said, the inclusion of the element of intentionality to live righteously. Is that right? That I am, or rightfully, or I think righteously, you said. And of course, I was thinking that when I saw it, I was thinking that as I wrote, in my comment, that assumes that it rests on a shared definition of what righteous is, like to live. So, what is the intention to achieve what kind of righteous goal of what righteousness? And my question is, how can that be, can intention that be effectively channeled or achieved in a context like we're talking about decolonization of academia, where there may be different ideas of what righteous is, and that would also include indigenous ideas what righteous is, and more broadly, whose intention should be prioritized or but I'll stop at that.
Yeah, thanks. I think for me, in thinking about how that works in a university setting is not so much that the system that's in place changes to a different system that's somebody else's system, but more about changing the system in a way that allows for differences of opinion or differences in the way that they operate, or the different systems of thought, so that if a student, or even a program or a department, if there's different ways and different perspectives that come with that student, with that program, with that department, with that professor, that there's allowances made for that there's not such stringent requirements to do X, Y, and Z, or to write in a certain format, or to use certain kinds of research, but to allow for different individuals or programs to make those decisions for themselves, and to have that be acceptable. So I think that to me, it's not about prioritizing necessarily, but about just allowing for, diverse ideas of what is righteous, right? Because my idea may be different than yours, which may be different than, the next person's. And so, to me, it's not about ranking that necessarily so much as it is about just making space for whatever it might be.
Okay, if I can follow up, and so that's actually great, because the thing that I thought immediately when I saw the definition is that to intentionally righteously means that, again, as you said, you and I may have a different idea what so it forces us to come to a consensus of what righteous means, in other words, to maybe to collaborate, to dialogue, to speak, and to come to a consensus, and then achieve, and then sort of work towards that. That's what makes me, it forces people to, or it forces, maybe, faculty and students and administrators in an academic context you have to come to a shared definition of what righteous is, in order to achieve decolonization. So that's brings, like you say, like we need to listen to one another, and not assume that my way is the way that should be, or your way is the way it should be.
Right. Yes, I think that, although I don't necessarily think that there needs to be a consensus, right? I think if to me, if my idea of living righteously is to you know, be as, you know, as decolonized in my eating habits, maybe as I possibly can be, right? And to do more hunting and more fishing and more gathering and, you know, have an organic garden. And to me, that feels right to me, and that feels like a decolonizing practice. Then, you know, that's what works for me. Whereas if someone else is feeling like to them decolonizing is, you know, means something different, then there's just room for both of those things to happen simultaneously, not necessarily requiring a consensus, I think.
Correct. And the last thing, in fact, what I meant by consensus, maybe it's the wrong word, is more than consensus, like to acknowledge there are other ways and to respect, you know, that's what I mean by consensus, but by, you know, acknowledging all that there are different ways of thinking and then to validate them. That was not to leave out anybody. Thank you.
I'd like to just add to something to that, Natana and Simone, because like it's like when you're talking about respect in terms of humans who think differently, have different practices, have different cultures, and we have to come to a place where we can work together, and that creates that respect. And this is just my opinion, you know, what I've come to learn over the years, but we also have to include, as I was saying earlier, respect for the earth, even in those decisions. We cannot leave it out. Because as Natana was saying, and I repeated that, you know, our ancient way, and reflected in our language, was that we and the earth are the same. We're one thing. And we can't be separated, okay? And when you live with the earth, there are certain ways that has to happen, because if you don't, you're destroying it. So you know, our ancestors looked at the earth, we followed our what we called original instructions, and the Creator gave us the way, which is, you know, all the systems of ecology and whatever you want to call it, biodiversity, you know, all of those things, that's what the Creator made. And we have to respect that as well. And that's got to be part and parcel of the whole construct of respect for other people, you know. I mean, and that to me is the piece that's always missing. And I think as far as, you know, what we say to other people, Natana, or what we offer them about what we, you know, we should or shouldn't offer in terms of our culture because of all the theft and everything, you know, I've talked about stuff like in a general sense, you know, just trying to get a point across. And I don't know, it's just something that, and I was saying this earlier in the other meeting with the education folks, that if we're going to talk about Native American philosophies, if you will, then we're the ones that have to figure out how to do it. Because other people aren't going to do it for us, because y'all wouldn't be sitting here listening to us if you had it figured out and could do it, you know. No offense to anybody, but and that's something that I, you know, learned a long time ago when I was working at Plymouth Plantation. I learned so much just from talking to people every day that came through our outdoor site. You know, you kind of learn what people don't know when they open their mouth, you know, and that was a big educational piece for me. So, and you learn how to say things to people, you know, at the level or the place that they're at and their understanding of things. So I feel like I'm starting to ramble, so
thank you. So Joyce, the time is run. Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you. I think that's a good spot to end, Linda. But the end is, I think, as tried to demonstrate through the Indigenous History Conference, the end is only the beginning. So we need to continue these conversations. Native American and Indigenous Studies plans to hold some forums in the fall, hopefully monthly. We'll see how that works out. But also, Lee, you'll be pleased to know that we do have book clubs through Native American and Indigenous Studies, that we read common books, and several people who are here, participate in those on a regular basis. We try to do one every semester. So that helps. And we invite our community, our local tribal communities in to participate as well. So, but thank you, everyone. I think that this was such a good way to start, and I appreciate the time that Lee and Linda and Natana took out of their day to have that. And so we will end there and begin again next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day, guys.
Bye.
Bye.